The UK Committee on Climate Change was actually established under our Climate Change Act, which is the one that requires the UK to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% by 2050. And what the Committee on Climate Change does is to provide recommendations for the UK Parliament about how ambitious we should be on the way towards that long-term 80% target. So we produce all the recommendations on the intermediate carbon targets for 2020, for the 2020s and out to 2030. And we also have the job of monitoring the government's progress every year and reporting to Parliament and, as it were, marking their scorecard to see how well they're doing and putting the policies in place. What we do is we have a nice framework of indicators. So we say these are the things that must be done by a certain stage. These are the milestones. And if government falls short on the milestones, yeah, we definitely flag the fact up and say, must work a bit harder in that area. Always had a fairly high-profile chair of the committee. Currently, it's a guy called Lord Deben, who, before he was ennobled, was called John Gummer, and he was actually Secretary of State for the Environment in the John Major government in the 1990s, and was given the accolade by Friends of the Earth of being, Britain's best environment secretary ever. So he's a high-profile guy, and he gives us the kind of leadership to it. And the rest of the people are basically mainly academics, but kind of academics that have always sort of interacted with policy or interacted with business. Trying to get people who are not in the ivory tower, as it were, is key to it. We're part of the landscape for climate policy, in the UK. We've recommended 5 different carbon budgets now, and one of them's still pending, but 4 of the budget recommendations have been accepted by government. And we think we've actually had quite a big impact on policy and, the kind of policies the government has put in place. And one I would definitely flag up is on renewables going into the electricity sector, where we actually had quite a strong set of recommendations about the policy framework you needed to get a much bigger deployment of renewable energy. And that's really been the way that the UK has gone over the last 5 years or so. Britain started from a very low level of renewable energy, a decade ago, but we're heading towards about 30% renewable energy in the electricity mix by about 2020, and could be going much further in the 2020s. So that's actually a significant change, because much of our renewables, unlike New Zealand, most of our renewables are in the form of wind, solar, a bit of biomass. So we don't have that big hydro in the background that New Zealand has, which is why we're at a lower percentage. But it's been quite a big achievement to get, to get that far. And we can go much further than that as well. Well, the target for 2020, which we will probably more than meet, is for a 34% reduction in emissions compared with 1990. And the 5th carbon budget that we've recommended, which is way out to 2030, is actually 57% below 1990 levels. So that's a very considerable movement towards that 80% target in 2050. Worthwhile saying, the committee also advises the Scottish Government as well as the UK one, and you can probably tell from my accent that's where I hail from. So I'm the committee's representative, up in Edinburgh. So the Scottish Government is actually more ambitious. It's actually had a 42% target for 2020, and it's going to, again, more than meet that, and it's actually reset the target for 50% reduction by 2020 compared with 1990. So a lot of things are happening, in terms of getting emissions down. We're on track, but one of the reasons that we have found it quite easy to meet our 2nd carbon budget period, which is the one we're in at the moment, and also the next one, is because we have seen a decline in economic activity. So economic activity is now lower than was originally anticipated when we set the carbon budgets. So that's one of the reasons why we're overachieving in terms of the budgets at the moment. And one of the risks that we need to look out for is a government taking its foot off the accelerator because, the immediate carbon budgets are quite easy to meet because of the background level of economic activity. And one of the things the committee has been strongly pointing out is that we need to keep the pressure on for the targets in the middle of the 2020s or for 2030, because it's easy at the moment. It's going to get much harder in about 10 years' time to hit the targets that the government has accepted. Absolutely, it's just changing the kind of growth that you've got. I mean, measures like energy efficiency are actually good for the economy because they reduce your dependence on imported energy, imported oil, imported gas, etc. And some forms of renewable energy are getting towards parity, with fossil fuel generation. We've seen very significant reductions in the cost of wind energy, even more significant reductions in the cost of solar, which surprisingly for the UK is, there's been big investments in solar energy in the UK, and that's because of the costs have been coming down. It makes definite sense to have, I think, a vigorous domestic carbon policy, however that is expressed in forms of targets or whatever. Because if you look at the Paris Agreement that's just come through and started talking about 1.5 degrees global warming as a limit, as well as 2 degrees, the only way to do that is to have very radical global emission reductions. And, no one country can sort of opt out of that. If the world is going to get emissions down, every country is going to need to do something in terms of its domestic emissions. And one of the lessons from the last report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that the sooner you put in place these emission reductions, the cheaper and the easier, it will be. So no country can opt out of it, I think, in terms of doing things at home.